So let's think a little bit about gardening. Why garden? Well, what kind of neighborhood do you want to live in? One with lots of different kinds of plants or one that's dominated by lawns? It's our choice. And there's a bigger question. More than just why garden, we wonder about how do we live our lives? When I get confused about life, that's the big question. I go looking for an instruction manual. I've read lots of books about life, the universe, and everything. But the teacher that really works for me, well, that's Mother Earth. The Earth has been evolving for billions of years. Life on the planet emerged about 3.5 billion years ago and has been changing ever since. Evolution, which we'll study later in this class, is a process of change from the simplicity of a single cell to the complexity of a rainforest ecosystem. Over all this time, Mother Earth seems to have evolved a few simple rules by which natural ecosystems function. Let's take a look at those rules. Well, here they are, three simple rules for gardening and perhaps for living. Sustainable systems rely on sunlight for energy. Everything material cycles. And for the first two rules to work effectively, the system needs to be biologically diverse. So let's try to apply these rules to a garden, using my own garden as an example. Welcome to a tour of my home garden. Well, my garden is solar powered, just like yours. I grow flowers and food. I think beauty is just as important as feeding yourself. I grow a lot of the standard vegetables. Here are some cucumbers growing on mulch hay. The mulch helps to keep the weeds under control and adds organic matter to the soil over time. Also protects the soil from drying out. I grow broccoli. Did you know that after you harvest the main head of the broccoli plant, you can get side shoots coming up if you watch carefully? Here's a small, kind of a baby side shoot growing up after the main head was cut. These side shoots come from axillary buds. We'll learn more about this later. They form in the axis of the main stem and a leaf petiole. Petiole is the part of the plant that connects the leaf blade to the stem. Notice a small bud that's emerging from the leaf axis. This small bud will form into a small broccoli head. Here's some Concord grapes growing on the fence here. We use these grapes to make jelly. I love that solar power on my toast. Of course, I grow tomatoes. Here's a couple of paste tomatoes that I use to make sauce. I grow onions, mostly from transplants. You can grow them from seed, of course. One of the keys to onions is to keep them free of weeds. Can you see how the leaves of the mature onions are laying down when they get ready to harvest? I grow peppers, which are sometimes a bit temperamental. Notice the small white flower in the picture on the left? If it gets too hot, these flowers will fall off. And since fruit comes from the flowers, that's not a good thing. I also grow some odd plants like this elderberry here. The fruit are used to make jams, and they can be eaten raw. I'm told it's high in antioxidants. I like just grabbing a handful as I walk by in the summer. Of course, I'm getting to be an elder myself, so I kind of relate. I have a few peach trees too. More years than not, however, a late spring cold snap kills the flowers. And of course, with no flowers, there's no fruit. This year was a good one. If you've never had a vegetable garden and want to get started, one of the easiest plants to grow are potatoes. Notice a small white stem connecting the main plant to these small developing potatoes. I don't grow potatoes underground, however. I usually put them under a mulch hay. I'll show you more about this later. Okay, so by now some of you are saying, "Well, I don't have a big backyard like you do." No excuse, however. We can grow herbs in wine barrels or radishes in a clay pot. If you have a place with sunshine, you can grow food. And with a little creativity, we can even grow tomatoes like those hanging on the wall there on the left, or pole beans out of those pots on the right, climbing up the poles. Doesn't take up very much room at all. And with just a little more space, you can get started growing a salad. And don't forget your compost and your worm bin. Even a small yard can have a contained compost bin like this one. All your food waste can be made into black gold, the organic residues can be used to improve your garden soil over time. And of course, if you have one of those really big backyards, well, let's take a look at what you can do there. This is an unheated hoop house I used to grow tomatoes late in the fall, right up to Thanksgiving in Massachusetts. It keeps the heavy rains off, and the plants have less disease problem. It also keeps them warm at night, and we get more fruit. We grow leafy green vegetables just about all year round. The newspaper is used to prevent weed growth between the rows of the seeded greens. It also prevents moisture loss from the soil. We plant one row each week throughout the year. In the coldest part of the winter, the greens can be covered with a protective cloth that lets the light in but keeps them warm and on really cold nights. We harvest greens right through the winter. You'll learn about this in class, how some varieties of leafy greens can actually freeze at night and thaw out during the day, and they survive through the deep winter months. And during February, the low light prevents them from growing very fast, but they'll stay alive and you can continue to harvest them. Oh, yes, we were talking about the rules of ecology, remember? Using solar power. In the fall of the year, I often plant oats because the seed is cheap and it comes up as a cover crop. This grassy cover crop covers the soil and protects it from blowing or washing away in the winter. And it collects sunlight and adds organic matter to the soil when it dies back during the winter. Of course, all plants need sunlight, even the weeds. We often cover a garden that had a lot of weeds the previous year with a black plastic tarp. It kills off the weeds for next year as they germinate underneath the tarp and die. We also use hay mulch to prevent weed growth. The hay adds a lot of valuable organic matter to the soil, but it brings in more weed seeds, kind of a trade-off. You can use a seedless straw, but that's expensive. All right, now let's move on to the second rule of ecology. Everything in nature cycles. The bumper sticker version of this rule is waste equals food. Let's see how that works. So I mentioned earlier you can have a compost, even in a small yard. We collect all our kitchen scraps. Compost is about the decaying process, but also compost create life. The smaller kitchen bucket is then emptied into a larger container outside the back door. Notice I've got some holes drilled in the side of this bucket to allow it to be aerated, and a lid with a bungee cord holding it down to keep the raccoons out. And every week or so, the kitchen waste goes out to the compost pile. We'll learn more about making composting later in this course. Now comes the fun part. I also take some of my kitchen wastes and feed them to the worms. Yep, worms. Worm farming or vermiculture is a rapidly growing garden activity and can even be done in a small apartment. Remember that waste equals food? The worms turn the waste into great potting soil, and the worms themselves become food for the chickens. Okay, so you live in an apartment. This won't work. But I have hens in my backyard. They get fed all sorts of scrap vegetables, trimmings, and stuff that got a little too old in the refrigerator. Notice the vegetables on top of the chicken run right here on the left, and the leafy vegetables on the right. They also get to eat the worms. We also give the worms food and water. The food is an organic grain to make sure they get the right nutrition to supplement the vegetable scraps. I live in an area where there's lots of farms, so I collect corn in the fall after the harvest. If you check at the end of rows where a corn harvester turned around, there are lots of ears of corn lying on the ground that haven't been harvested. The hens love the corn kernels, which I feed them all winter, and it's free. Waste equals food. And in the winter, I collect some old leafy greens from the hoop house that weren't doing so well and treat the hens with some fresh greens from time to time. Sometimes I'll even grow grass in seedling flats for the girls. They really love that fresh grass. So waste equals food is the process of feeding scraps to the hens and collecting the eggs. Everything cycles in Mother Nature. The worms become part of the chicken, the chickens create eggs. And waste equals food can kind of work for other things. What do you do with your old newspaper? Recycling newspaper, of course, is good, but I like to turn our newspapers into soil. We put newspaper down on the garden for weed prevention. The slick glossy ads are not used in the garden because of the potential for heavy metals, but the rest of the newspaper is fine. Most of the black ink today is made up from soy anyway. After the paper goes down, we cover it with hay mulch. Here you see a heavily mulched patch of rhubarb. The hay mulch cuts off the light from the weeds that are trying to grow up between the rhubarb plants and protects the soil from losing too much moisture. Here's some other areas where waste equals food. We burn wood during the winter. Notice the bucket of wood ash next to the stove. Wood ash is a great fertilizer, lots of potassium, a required element for plants. Potassium is sometimes called potash, as in ashes from a cooking stove. Here is what we do with our wood ash. The wood ash goes right out in the garden. Remember that waste equals food, and it'll feed the plants next year. Our final ecological rule is to support biological diversity. That is lots of different kind of plants and animals in one place. The main animal we have in our gardens are chickens. These are broilers or meat birds, not hens. The hens are female and produce eggs. We keep the females around all year long. The meat bear birds are all males. They grow faster. Here's how we treat them. We buy the chicks from a local farm supply store. They're also available by mail order. We keep them warm indoors for about 3 weeks before they go outside. They spend the next 5 to 6, 7 weeks out in the garden. Here they are feeding on some old strawberries. After the berries were picked, we weed whacked the plants and put the chickens on the old berry patch. They love to eat the bugs and leave their droppings to fertilize next year's garden. The chickens are moved around the garden depending on where we need fertilizer or where we need them to eat bugs. They need a bit of shade on the hot days. After about 8 to 10 weeks, they're killed and put in the freezer. We've raised turkeys too. Now, I don't live on a farm, remember. This is a normal suburban backyard. Before you try this, however, be sure and check your local zoning laws. Bees produce honey in our backyard and help pollinate the fruit trees. Bees add biological diversity to the garden. By mixing lots of different kind of plants and animals into the landscape, it kind of confuses the predator bugs and makes it possible to grow a garden without pesticides. So these are Mother Nature's rules for gardening and for life. Mother Earth has supported life for 4.5 billion years. Maybe she's learned something in all that time, and maybe we can learn something by copying her. So these are the rules. We break these rules at our own peril. Climate change, the hypoxic or the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, these are major global problems that happen because you and I break these rules regularly. But wait, I'm only one person. I don't really make a difference, do I? What's the big deal here? Jared Diamond wrote a best-selling book called Collapse a few years ago about how societies choose to fail or to succeed over and over again. We really haven't learned very much from history. Of course, the same story can be found in the Lorax, because everybody needs a Thneed. So where do I begin? Wait a minute, I don't have a big backyard. What do I do? Well, next spring, look under your kitchen sink or wherever you store some potatoes and see if you got some potatoes that are beginning to sprout. That is, they grow little green shoots out of the eyes. Take those potatoes outside, cover them up with a little straw or hay mulch or even some old leaves. Watch them grow. The picture on the upper left shows my potatoes plants growing through the straw mulch. And if you push back that straw mulch somewhere in the late July or early August, you'll find potatoes. It's really not hard to get started playing by Mother Nature's rules. Why not give it a try?